A friend of mine asked if I would take a look at his new collectible form. It's a Jazz Inc Snowspeeder. It's 1/6 scale, so it's very large. The details are great. The injection molded materials are very nice and very high quality. And overall, it's very well done. But there was a problem at the factory the day this went out the door because quality control was just not there. So the first thing that I noticed was the adhesive. Now, when you're spending a couple of $1,000s on a collectible, you don't expect to see this. And I'm not sure how it could happen. Someone decided, after making these really nice injection molded pieces, that the best way to bond them together was to use glue like it was welding sheet metal. And it doesn't work. There's big gaps, there's visible adhesive, and it's kind of a mess. The next thing that I noticed was that the gun barrels are bent. I could see how this could happen. I mean, if you're not familiar with the Snowspeeder design and you're putting this together, you would look at it and go, okay, the barrels of the guns line up with the points on the front of the aircraft. And so when they were putting it together, they just bent the barrel so that it would line up with the way they thought it should go. There were also problems with these large rotocastings that made up the back of the main guns. Unfortunately, there was a bit of a design issue here. They didn't mate properly with the rest of the Snowspeeder, but also the parts were just misshapen and deformed and would have to be completely replaced. Rounding things out, there was what appeared to be pet hair embedded in the paint in a half a dozen places on the surface of the model. The graphics were peeling up in places, the weathering was very slapdash and unprofessional looking, and the overall fit and finish of a lot of the body panels was very questionable. So, problematic? Yeah. Fixable? Absolutely. The first thing that I did was to tackle those misshapen parts on the main guns. I drew up new parts using Shaper 3D and then printed them in resin. The way the Snowspeeder had been assembled at the factory meant that I really couldn't take it apart fully the way I would have liked to have, but I went as far as I could with it just to make the refinishing and painting process as painless as possible. The cockpit had been very nicely painted and detailed, and I think the only thing I did with that was to give it a clear matte finish, and I changed the lighting from 3 volts to 12 volts. The next step was to fix those long seams on the leading edges of the wings. I used an X-Acto knife to pry open a little bit of space between the factory glue welds, and then I flowed in some resin bond, and once the resin bond set, then I ground off the factory glue blobs that were left behind. Once those lumps of glue were gone, I could then start doing the body work of filling all of the edge seams and blending out all of those gaps that were around the nose of the ship. I also injected in some UV resin to get rid of some seams that ran down the center line of the underside of the Snowspeeder. They just didn't belong there, and it was easy enough to get rid of them. With most of the more obvious bodywork now done, I went to the next step, which was removing those graphics that were on the hull. They were a vinyl peel and stick, and I was able to slide a knife underneath those and then give it a quick sand to remove any residue. The next step, primer. Before going into primer, I sanded the entire Snowspeeder with 400 grit wet dry paper. There was a lot of animal hair and grit and just foreign stuff in the factory paint finish that I had to get rid of before I could put my paint on top. I used a water-based industrial black primer to spray down all of the parts of the Snowspeeder. I used a black primer because I wanted to make sure that I completely covered over any of the original paint from the factory finish that the Snowspeeder had originally, and black just gives me that color density that I need for that. So once the black primer dried, I gave it a quick wet sand with 400 grit paper, and then I sprayed the whole model again using a water-based white primer that I had tinted to what I'm calling the factory finish. The factory finish is a little bit lighter than what the model will ultimately end up being because it's going to darken during weathering. So it was right about this time that I came across a whole cache of photographs of an original screen-used Snowspeeder that was coming up for auction. Now, the timing on finding those pictures was really pretty perfect because I was just about to get into weathering. The problem was those pictures showed the underside of the Snowspeeder and how it didn't have these rectangular holes all over the place. Now, I'm guessing these rectangular holes had to be some unavoidable part of the injection molding process, but I couldn't have them there. So I ended up filling them with Bondo, sanding them all down again, repainting the underside of the hull, and then moving on to the next stage of painting. After a lot of masking and spraying, I ended up with the Snowspeeder looking like it was factory fresh, with its color patterns and graphics all applied and ready to go to the next step, my favorite step, weathering. So with weathering, you're telling the history of the model that you're building. And in this case, it's a model in the Star Wars universe, and Star Wars vehicles are used. So they're dirty and greasy and dinged, and they've got scuffs on them and laser blast marks and all these things. And so when I'm painting the Snowspeeder, it's basically building it up in layers. And you'll see as these pictures scroll through that each picture gets a little more weathered and a little more weathered because you're building up those layers until you get to that comfortable place where it feels like it belongs in the Star Wars universe. And with the Snowspeeders, I had some really great reference from the auction pictures, but I also took some liberties of my own because I didn't want to try to make a clone of a vehicle. I wanted it to have its own bit of character. So now we have a pretty nice representation of Luke's Snowspeeder from The Empire Strikes Back. It's been color corrected and painted properly. The parts that were warped or damaged have been replaced, things have been straightened out, seams have been removed, and overall it's a much nicer version of that vehicle. Now the Jazz Inc model was a really great basis to work off of. Like I've said, those injection molds were very nice. The parts were very nice. The quality of the plastics that they used was top notch. Somewhere along the line though, in the assembly process, it just fell apart. And I don't know where that happened, and I'm sure they wouldn't be happy to see how that model left their factory. But here it is, fixed and much better than it was before. One last thing. Luke needs a harpoon gunner, and that's Dak. And Dak, seen here, has a very plain helmet. So I took one of Luke's helmets and painted it white, then made a mask to spray on his blue insignia, and then weathered it down a bit to give us a Dak helmet.